Thank you to these sponsors of the Before I Die New Mexico Virtual Festival in 2020. A Good Goodbye, Gail Rubin puts the fun in funeral planning. After, a new way to stay connected with your loved ones in the cemetery anytime and anywhere. Aquamationinfo.com, where you can learn about alkaline hydrolysis, an eco-friendly alternative to flame cremation. Compassion and Choices, offering care and choice at the end of life. Daniel's Family Funerals and Cremations and Gabaldon Mortuary in Albuquerque. Fairview Memorial Park and Vista Verde Memorial Park in Albuquerque and Rio Rancho. Avista Cremation and Burial in Santa Fe. DeVargas Funeral Home and Crematory in Espanola and in Taos. Estate Pros, which offers personal dispersal of possessions due to a move, illness, or death. French Funerals and Cremations and Sunset Memorial Park in Albuquerque. And Keeper, which helps you keep memories alive with online tributes to preserve, celebrate, and share life legacies.
Death is full of surprises, huh?
You have no idea.
Yes, I'm Gail Rubin, the Doyenne of Death. Welcome to today's session with Barbara Mancini, the author of Cruel Death, Heartless Aftermath. And the subtitle is My Family's End of Life Nightmare and How to Avoid It. I wanted to start out with a short reading from her book that I think really drives home some of the key issues that she brings up in this book. Her 93-year-old father, Joseph Yorshaw, had pre-planned. He didn't want to be in the hospital. He had advanced medical directives and had plotted everything out. And in spite of all that, and Barbara will tell you how this happened, but he wound up going to the hospital where he didn't want to be. And in chapter 4, Descent into Despair, this is the scene she paints at 7 p.m. on Thursday. From the ER, Dad had been admitted to a telemetry unit. A nursing assistant had been assigned to observe him in his room at all times. Because a third party is present, I am finally permitted to see him. Assessing Dad's condition, a nurse has written, he is lethargic but alert to stimuli. His bodily functions are being monitored by machines that beep and buzz, blinking in bright neon colors, continuously displaying his heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and the oxygen in his blood. Oxygen tubing loops around his chin and ears and then splits to enter each nostril. A transparent bag of IV fluid hanging from a pole slowly drips fluid into a vein in his arm. Gone is his favorite wool blanket. Instead, he is encased in bright white hospital linens. The plastic ID band on his wrist is a stark symbol that he now is in a place where the people caring for him do not know him. He is only a few miles from home, but a world away from the comfort and familiarity of the only place where he had hoped to die. My friends, please welcome Barbara Mancini, the author of this book, Cruel Death, Heartless Aftermath. She has a story for you, and it's going to prompt a great discussion. Barbara, welcome to your session here at the festival.
Thank you, Gail. I'm going to go to share screen because I'm going to share some slides with everybody today. I wish I had never had occasion to write a memoir. Putting the words on the page was a long and difficult process, but I felt compelled to do it to raise awareness about the perils that the dying and their caregivers face. I wrote this book so hopefully no one else would have to go through a similar experience. And I really think that the heart of the matter of this and what I went through and what we all face is this: who decides how you will die? So I'm going to talk briefly. I'm not going to spend the whole time talking, so we have some questions. In my book, I quote Justice Benjamin Cardozo. Benjamin Cardozo was a justice on the New York State Court of Appeals, and then he later became a United States Supreme Court justice. And he wrote the following words from an opinion that he penned on a case. He said, "Every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body." Now, at the time Justice Cardozo wrote these words, this was 1912, cancer barely made the top 10 causes of death. Well, we know since then we've had a lot of improvements in public health, in sanitation, nutrition, and of course, medical advances. And those improvements have increased our life expectancies by over 30 years. But these medical advances have also changed how we die. And most of us, pandemic notwithstanding, will die from chronic disease, which means that we will endure years of failing health before our deaths. I think it's very significant that this revered jurist recognized over 100 years ago that people deserve the right to have their values and healthcare choices respected. I often wonder what Justice Cardozo would say if he knew that over a century after he wrote this, that your healthcare decisions would still remain a point of contention and controversy. So, as I detail in my book, and this is a very brief synopsis, in 2013, I was arrested in Pennsylvania and charged with aiding the attempted suicide of my dying 93-year-old father after handing him his prescribed morphine. His pain was not being properly treated by the hospice, and he took much more than the prescribed dose. When I told a hospice nurse what had happened, she called 911, and police ordered paramedics to take my father to the hospital for life-prolonging treatment in defiance of his written and stated wishes. He then endured 5 days of unwanted medical treatment. I would call it medical torture, which sadly even included having his hands restrained. He died 5 days later from pneumonia and sepsis. And I endured a year-long prosecution, incurring legal fees of over $100,000 until a judge ultimately dismissed the case against me. And here's the thing. At a time when most people still avoid having end-of-life discussions, we had multiple conversations with my father about his goals of care and his wishes. He had a written advance directive. And still, our careful planning and attempts to do the right thing for my dying father devolved into an unthinkable end-of-life nightmare. And we found ourselves in the crosshairs of healthcare and legal systems that unfortunately often thwart people's wishes instead of honoring them. So why do healthcare systems fail to honor a person's end-of-life wishes? Well, there are a number of answers to that. One factor is the strong imperative of healthcare systems to save lives. You know, death is the enemy. Another factor are people who disagree with your values and wishes and who have the power to override or disregard your careful planning. These people may be relatives, they may be healthcare providers, or they may be government officials. And this clearly happened with my father. His clearly stated healthcare directive was dismissed by both the hospice and the police. Another factor can be incompetent or inadequate end-of-life care. People assume that hospice care will ensure a comfortable and peaceful passing, but that's not always the case. And of course, politics surrounding how and when you are allowed to die. End-of-life choices are as much of a political minefield as reproductive choices. And powerful groups have inserted themselves into what should be personal and private decisions. And you know that politics always enters this discussion. Some people feel that their values and sensitivities should allow them to interfere with or have a say in what kind of medical care you are allowed to receive. And we know that politicians pander to these groups, and they have been a major factor in impeding the passage of aid in dying legislation. So I discuss this at length in my book and a lot of the details of our particular experience. But you might be asking yourselves, how does this pertain to you? How does this affect you in New Mexico or whatever other state you may live in? And it's relevant to you because it could happen to you or your loved ones too. For example, the New Mexico statute that criminalizes aiding a suicide is equally as vague and open to interpretation as the Pennsylvania law. And this holds true in many other states. So this is the law under which I was charged in Pennsylvania. And it says here, a person who intentionally aids or solicits another to commit suicide is guilty of a felony of the second degree if his conduct causes such suicide or attempted suicide. And in my state, Pennsylvania, a conviction on this charge will get you up to 10 years in prison. In New Mexico, this is the law. It says assisting suicide consists of deliberately aiding another in the taking of his own life. So in New Mexico, this is a 4th degree felony. Now, like the Pennsylvania statute, the New Mexico law does not specify what actions rise to the level of aiding or assisting a suicide. And this is a big problem because these vaguely written criminal laws are then left open to interpretation by law enforcement and by prosecutors. And they very likely violate what's called the vagueness doctrine. That is a constitutional rule that states that criminal laws must state specifically and explicitly what conduct is punishable. So you might be wondering, if these laws are unconstitutional, why are they still in effect? They still remain in place because it would take a long and difficult process through the appellate courts to challenge them. And just so you know, in New Mexico, a 4th degree felony carries up to 18 months in prison and fines up to $5,000. Now, that's not nearly as harsh as the penalty in Pennsylvania, but you should realize that any kind of felony conviction carries profound effects on a person's life. You can lose a job, you can end up losing your right to vote, depending on what state you're in. You can have difficulty finding housing, insurance rates go up. So there are very, very profound consequences to any kind of a felony conviction. Now, the prosecutor in my case interpreted the Pennsylvania law to mean that providing a dying man his legally prescribed medicine rose to the felony level of aiding what they claimed was a suicide attempt. This prosecutor presumed to know what my father's intent was on that day. and proceeded with the prosecution, despite the fact that my father was permitted by law and by physician order to self-administer his own medicines. And I'll mention here too that these laws make no distinction between the desire of the dying to have a comfortable and peaceful end on their own terms versus the mental health crisis that leads to suicide. In fact, the only jurisdictions that make this kind of distinction are the ones that have enacted aid in dying. Now, there was an attempt in New Mexico to allow aid in dying back in 2014, and that was through a court ruling that only covered Bernalillo County. That ruling was overturned by the New Mexico Court of Appeals in 2015. I know that the panel following my discussion today will be discussing this and aid in dying legislation. And this is a very important discussion because my case highlights how the current laws in most states disregard the view of the majority of people in every state that terminally ill individuals should be allowed to determine their final care. Now, I'll say that prosecutions like mine are not common, but they do occur. And in my book, I talk about several other prosecutions of aiding suicide that have occurred. So as it currently stands, caregivers have to fear arrest and prosecution for advocating for their dying loved ones. And the dying still have to fear having unwanted medical treatment forced upon them because someone in a position of power decides that their end-of-life wishes will not be honored. My case certainly raised some issues about what family members face when they're caring for a loved one at the end of life. It is a scary prospect to know that the decisions you make can be examined critically through the lens of a prosecutor. Now, I was very lucky that the judge ruled the case against me had no merit. So I won my court case. But I can tell you that the whole experience was devastating on many, many levels for my family and me. Now, my father's nightmare began with the hospice. And my biggest regret is that I didn't do more to research hospice care and to know what their legal obligations were to people under their care. I just assumed that the hospice would do what they were supposed to do and what they were being paid to do. And I will tell you that is not a safe assumption to make. Experts in the hospice industry will admit that hospices vary greatly in their quality of care. And I discuss this at quite a bit of length in the book. I did a great deal of research on it. And I do this because it's so important to be aware of the quality care issues at the end of life. You should know that hospice standards are governed by federal regulations, and these regulations are extensive. I will say that if a hospice company can meet those regulations, they absolutely will be providing good quality care. And you don't need to know all the regulations. I do have links to them in my book, and I also have them on my website. But I feel that there's just a very few that are really, really important for you to be aware of. So this is covered under the Code of Federal Regulations. It says that hospices must provide all the care related to the terminal illness. And the patient has the right to receive effective pain management and symptom control. Regulations say patient needs and goals are the priority. Drugs given to hospice patients must meet their needs, and they must be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I put this other regulation in here because I think it's important for everyone to know this, that hospices get paid every day that a person is enrolled, regardless of whether they receive any services on a given day. In other words, they get paid no matter what. This payment structure has unfortunately led to the explosion of for-profit hospices in this country. In fact, in the last year, 100% of new hospice companies that have been created are for-profit companies. And it has led many, many hospice companies to minimize the services that they provide to people under their care. So I think that's really important that everybody is aware of that. And in my book, I do have an appendix that lists questions you should be asking prospective hospice providers so that you can make a good choice that fits with your values and your needs. So I'm not going to talk a lot longer. I just want to give you my most important cautions because I want to open this up for discussion and questions. But my most important cautions are this, is that you and your loved ones are at risk for prosecution until the law changes. And I'm hoping that, in the near future, there will be a lot more states that have an option like medical aid in dying available. You need to choose a hospice provider with great care so that proper care is provided for your loved one and that your family members are protected. And finally, having open discussions about your wishes and your goals of care and documenting them is still the most important thing you can do to ensure that your end-of-life care is appropriate and aligns with your values. So I just want to show you one more thing. I do have a website. It's barbaramancinistory.com. And on that website, I have additional information and resources that people can access, along with links to hospice regulations. And I'm going to punt this back to Gail so that we can do discussion and questions.
Okay, great presentation. Thank you, Barbara. So in regard to the prosecution of your handing that morphine to your father, what happened with that and how has that changed the course of your life?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the prosecution lasted a full year. And I went through several court dates and a county court judge dismissed the case against me, but it was a long and arduous process. And it's interesting, in the course of my being able to get the evidence that the prosecution had, which the evidence was my father's hospital and hospice records, it was pretty stunning to me when I finally had my hands on that. And I found out that my father had been prescribed a much larger dose of morphine than he ever received from the hospice. And they never mentioned that to the police. And the prosecutor in the case never read those records. So at the court hearing night I had, he was rather embarrassed to find out that there was a narrative and evidence that disproved what the hospice witnesses were saying in their testimony. So it was like a kind of a plot line that I never could have expected, and it was actually real life for me. So how has it affected my life? It's had a profound effect on my life. I would say the number one thing is that I play over in this never-ending loop in my mind my father's final days. It's a very painful thing to revisit. And boy, I wish it could have been different for him. And, it had a profound effect on me and my family. I mean, I lost my job for a while. I was offered my job back after my case was dismissed, but it's just not something that you really get over. And the reason I decided to speak up about this is I don't want to see this ever happen to someone else. And I want to make people aware of these kind of perils that can face caregivers and their loved ones at the end of life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you have a nursing background and you've transitioned more into legal issues.
Well, I became an advocate for end of life options after
Mhm.
this happened to me, and I also for criminal justice advocacy. And because I mean, I had firsthand experience with how unfair this system is, and I know that I'm someone who has a lot more advantages than a lot of people who find themselves, entangled in the criminal justice system. I'm a white person. I'm educated. I'm middle class. I had the money to hire a lawyer, that kind of thing. So I had a number of advantages. And one big advantage I had was that I had the public on my side.
Mm.
There were dozens of opinion pieces and editorials written about my case. We're talking from the LA Times to the New York Times and papers in between. And not one of them supported the decision to prosecute me. In fact, they squarely criticized the prosecution and the hospice. So, it's very rare that someone who's charged with a crime has that kind of public support. And I really, really appreciated all the people who voiced their support for me.
Mhm.
But even with that, it's been very difficult, journey having this happen to my dad and to me. So it's tough, and I don't think it should ever happen to anyone else. And that's one of the motivations for me writing this memoir.
So we have a question for you in the chat. Jan Wilson posed the question, do you feel that hospice care and the frequency of healthcare providers honoring one's advance directive has improved since your awful ordeal?
Well, my answer to that would be probably no. And the reason I say that, I've looked at articles in medical journals that talk about end of life care. And yes, some people who have hospice care are very satisfied, but there still are an unacceptable number of people who die suffering a great deal. So, in a global view of it, I don't think it's improved very much. I will also mention here that I have links to this on my website and in my book. In 2018 and 2019, the Office of the Inspector General at Health and Human Services released multiple reports on quality care issues in hospice care. And it's kind of like a horror story when you read some of these cases where poor quality care was received. And I'm going to loop back to what I said earlier in my prepared remarks. Hospices are paid every single day from the time a person is enrolled until they either die or leave. So what's happening with those funds that they're being provided? If they're not being used to properly care for these people, it's a big issue. And Health and Human Services feels that hospices need to have much greater oversight. It's improved from the time when my father was in hospice, but it's not at the level where it needs to be to ensure that everybody's getting the quality care that they need.
Well, we have a question from Bob Hoffman in DC, and I was just typing to him to feel free to unmute and turn on your video if you want to ask a question.
I have felt free to turn on my video, and I'm feeling free to ask Barbara a couple of questions after her very articulate and poignant presentation. Thank you, Barbara, for doing that. 3 quick questions, if I could. One, what was it that was deficient in the advance directive that did not allow them to follow it? If you can articulate whatever, when they looked at it, they didn't want to follow the instructions. Number 2 is, if I understood you correctly, there was morphine there and you took the morphine and handed it to him. If that, or I'd like a little more detail on what the assertion was about what level of assertiveness you took in giving him the morphine. And number 3, on what grounds did they dismiss the case eventually?
Okay, the first one, what did they do with the advance directive? I have no idea. I don't even know if they looked at it. Now, it was documented in my father's hospice record that he had a living will. So, and we had it there in the house, but whether they actually looked at it, I have no idea. When this happened that day, I was telling the law enforcement people and the hospice, my father has a living will. He doesn't want this. I said it over and over again, but it didn't seem to have much of an effect on them. Now, my dad was in hospice care for 2 weeks with no medicine for pain, even though he said every day that he was in pain. He had had morphine prescribed in the past, so it wasn't the first time, you know, he would have had something like that. And after 2 weeks, I called the hospice and I asked them to prescribe morphine. And the person I talked to at the hospice was a team leader, and she told me on the phone that morphine was not appropriate for him to be taking, even though he'd been prescribed it in the past. And we went back and forth about that. And she said to me, well, I'll talk to the doctor and see if he can get it. So he was prescribed morphine, didn't get it until 2 days later. And the amount that he was prescribed was a very low dose. It was 2.5 milligrams every 4 hours. Anyone who's familiar with that knows that it's an extremely low dose, and it didn't help his pain. The day of the incident, my father asked me to hand him his morphine. It was in a 1-ounce vial. And my mother had been giving him the morphine previously, and he always would open the cap for her because it was a childproof cap and she couldn't open it. And then she would measure out the dose. So I did the same routine that day with him when he asked me for the morphine. I handed the vial to him. He opened the cap. I had the dosing syringe in my hand, and he quickly consumed what was left in that vial before I could measure out the dose. So I realized he probably took a pretty big amount of morphine. And I was left to decide, what do I do now? And he had been very, very clear about what he wanted. So I sat and waited with him. And a hospice nurse came by 2 hours later. My dad was drowsy, but he was not unconscious. He was breathing normally, able to respond to questions, able to follow commands. But they kicked into this, we got to get him to the ER gear. And that's when things really deteriorated. It wasn't until I got my father's records in the discovery process during the criminal case that I found out that my father actually had been prescribed morphine the day he enrolled in hospice, and it was the hospice that withheld it. And the morphine that was prescribed for him initially was at a much higher dose and much more frequent dosing interval than he ultimately received when I called the hospice and asked him to provide that. I also found when I read my father's records that hospice employees frequently used the phrase that my father was comfortable despite pain. To me, that was an outrage to document that my father was comfortable even though he was in pain. I mean, it's just a ridiculous oxymoron. I also found that the hospice documented several times that my father had improved symptoms 75% of the time or greater, which was not true. And it actually contradicted what the social worker documented on my father, saying that my father feels hopeless, that he won't feel any better, and he's going to continue to suffer. So there were a lot of issues with the hospice care that I wasn't aware of at the time this happened that day with my father. And one of the reasons I wrote about it and did some investigation on hospice care. I forgot what the third question was.
Well, let me just get one. The third question has to do with why the judge dismissed the case. But
Oh,
let me ask
okay.
just to be really clear about it. The morphine was there,
Mhm.
and you handed him the bottle and
The vial,
while
yeah.
you were getting ready, he swallowed the morphine that was in the bottle.
Mhm.
Okay, so because you handed it to him
And he
and were
took it.
preparing it, and he took it without you encouraging him, he just took it because you were getting ready for something else, but he took it, and they blamed that on you.
Yes.
Okay,
And
so
they claimed that I knew his intent was to end his life. I never said that, but that was what they claimed.
And by the way,
And
were you his healthcare proxy?
yes,
And when they then decided they wanted to take him back to the hospital, did you try to stop that from happening?
I did. I protested vigorously, and the police said to me, "You no longer have any say in what happens to your father."
And why is that?
Well, they're law enforcement.
But
They thought some terrible crime occurred. I'm assuming. I mean,
oh, okay.
don't
I
ask
see.
me to get inside the head of the people
Okay,
who
I
made these
get it.
decisions.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
And what about the dismissal? What was the grounds on that?
The judge determined that the case had no merit, and she wrote a 46-page scathing opinion or decision on this, and she criticized everybody involved, from the hospice to the police to the prosecutor. And I'll quote my attorney on this. He said that Judge Russell beat the shit out of them with that ruling.
Mhm.
And she did. The judge criticized from beginning to end how this whole thing was handled. So she said the case really had no merit. It should never have been brought.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And congratulations on the whole thing, if that's the right word.
Well, I don't know, I don't feel like, yes, I won the court case, but, in many ways, everybody lost
Yeah.
in a situation like this. Yeah.
Is your mom still alive?
Yes, she is.
H-
She's
how did-
91 years old now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit about how this affected the rest of your family?
It was traumatic for everybody. I'm married. I have 2 adult children now, but at the time that happened, my older daughter was a freshman in college and my younger one was still in high school.
Mhm.
And, I lost my job during that, so I lost that income. And, my family stood by me through thick and thin. I mean, I'm really lucky for that. My mother was very traumatized by this whole thing. I mean, 60 Minutes did an episode on my case, and she couldn't watch it.
Mm.
And she just, she relives the horror just like I do. And she was put in a terrible position too. She was asked when my father was at the hospital to give her consent for them to treat him. And the police told my mother that if my father died, things would go much worse for me. So my mother's trying to honor his advance directive, but she's also being told, but you better not die or your daughter's going to be in a lot worse trouble. Put her in an impossible position.
Hi, Barbara. Nice to see you after these years from your visit to Santa Fe a bit ago. My question is, everything everything you've done, what's your takeaway about the role of the proxy or the surrogate or the healthcare decision maker? In other words, what would you have done different if you had it to do over again that you've learned from this experience?
I definitely would have done more research on hospice care.
You said that.
That's where the problem started, absolutely. And I didn't know what they were required legally to provide for people under their care. Had I known that, I could have advocated much more effectively for my father. And I will tell you right now, I would have terminated that hospice. I would have, and found someone else, found another hospice provider that does quality end of life care. And that's one reason why I go in great detail in my book at how to evaluate to the best of one's ability whether a hospice is a good fit. So I think any healthcare proxy should have that information available and know it, because, and I also want to make this clear, I am not condemning hospices. There are hospices out there that provide great end-of-life care. And those are the ones who we should be able to find. It shouldn't be such an arduous process for people to find quality hospice providers. But as it stands right now, it's very difficult for people to discern who's doing a good job and who isn't. So there's a tool on Medicare.gov. It's called Care Compare. And there's some information on hospices on that, on their quality care, but that information is self-reported by hospices. Mm-hmm. So how much can you trust that? Are they going to say, well, we're not doing a very good job at pain relief, but let's face it, they're not going to be honest. I wish there were some other reliable way for healthcare consumers to be able to give their business to quality care providers when it comes to end-of-life care.
Right. Just a couple of thoughts about that and a little bit of a follow-up. It seems to me, again, that at the front end of either for yourself or for a loved one going to hospice, that really taking the time at the front end with the intake person, with the administrator, finding out if they are open to supporting, voluntary stopping eating and drinking, just sort of getting a sense of who they are and how they function, and also talking with former clients. All of that feels to me to be helpful. I guess the other thing that I would say is that I think what you've experienced with hospice is not that different than what we also experience in acute care facilities and ICUs, other places that we're going to be going as we near end of life. And that same sort of due diligence of the proxy of loved ones at the front end and sort of staying with the process, it takes a lot of diligence and a lot of wherewithal to be a good surrogate. And
Absolutely.
Again, your horrible experience with hospice, I would say overall, my guess is that hospices in the scope of things do somewhat better than most acute care hospitals around these issues. So that's what I draw from your experiences, how much work it takes to be a good proxy.
I absolutely agree with you. And that's one reason I put information in the appendices in my book. It's right there. It's easy for you to access. Gives you some helpful guidelines especially when you're evaluating a hospice. And I also agree with what you say about acute care situations. Just a few years ago, my mother, who has completed an advance directive and a Pennsylvania POLST form, had an evaluation by an interventional cardiologist because she had a lot of chest pain. And she's very clear that she does not want to ever be put on a ventilator or have dialysis or many other things. And this cardiologist who evaluated her tried to talk her out of the decision she had made on her advance directive. And I was with her at the time. And I finally had to say to this doctor, it's not your decision. And I was just so upset that he was trying to talk her out of decisions that she clearly had made. We had many discussions about it. Her goals of care are to live as independently as possible and as comfortably as possible. And he kept talking about it prolonging her life. And he and I kind of came to an argument in that exam room because he was just so tone deaf about it. So I understand exactly what you're saying when you bring that up about acute care. It does happen. Yeah.
We will be continuing this conversation in the next session with a whole panel talking about our prospects for medical aid in dying in New Mexico. So let's wrap it up here and then meet in the next Zoom room. Barbara, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and helping us to understand these issues. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next session.
Sounds